Yeah.
So it comes from the 1980s, when there's a lot of change in the production process. The production has moved, mostly to third world countries due to mechanization, etc., and the old working class struggles and solidarities are dying down. So in the 80s, if you're going to talk about identity politics, then mostly it was women and Black struggles, with some disability movements coming on board as well, but they hadn't articulated themselves in that way until sort of the latter part of, or into the 80s. But 60s and 70s is where the identity politics, I suppose, had started, but they weren't called that. In the 80s, they begin to be called as identity politics. And so a lot of us from, Black struggles, anti-racist struggles and feminist struggles have been part of what's been called identity politics. And so all the criticisms that go with the identity politics sometimes feel quite harsh, because, we've lived through those. But in terms of its analysis, it's usually argued that these identity politics are post-modernist, so they don't sort of have any concrete analysis in facts, but are much more subjective and experientially based. So they argue that, there are certain groups like women, like Black people, disabled people, or particular people from particular castes, etc., are a group who are stigmatized, not included, and not represented politically in mainstream structures. And a part of the reason is because as groups, they've been stigmatized and looked down upon and excluded on those bases. And so if you are a part of that group, if you're women, if you're Black people, then you share the commonalities of that experience, of that oppression, of that exploitation. And the subjectivity, I suppose, comes into it in the sense that unless there was a feeling that unless you are a part of those groups, then you don't understand what it's like to be that. And therefore, other people who are outside of that group would feel that couldn't really empathize with it, and therefore you couldn't be trusted to be an ally, I suppose. So, for women, men are the main enemy. For Black people, white people are the main enemy, and therefore alliances are difficult. On the other hand, they provided a good basis in which people could get together, share those experiences that they haven't necessarily been able to share before, as politically viable and publicly acknowledged and accepted as valuable experiences that could be talked about in the public. And so therefore, particularly for women, but also for Black people, that was the phrase that the personal is political. So, for a lot of people, that was quite strong. It was a consciousness raising space, and therefore it was helpful in galvanizing those people as a people who could talk about their own oppression and fight and resist against it. However, it's been criticized that it was just experiential, it was subjective, not grounded in objective struggles, particularly ignoring class divisions. And then later on in the 90s, we get the notion of intersectionality that talks about multiple identities, so that these groups, women are not just women, Black people are not just Black people. There are also oppressors within the group, so there are capitalists within the group, there are men within the group who oppress, and many other forms of oppression within it, so that you can't just rely upon one identity. Identities, there's a matrix of identities that overlap and compound each axis of oppression, that they interact. So if the argument was that identity politics in itself, in the way that we knew it in the earlier period, weren't connecting enough to other forms of oppression, then intersectionality gives you that space in which those connections can be made. However, there's still that criticism that just identity politics per se is not grounded in class analysis. It doesn't take account of how economics is the foundation of other forms of struggles, and that economic divisions and exploitation and oppression gives shape to other forms of ideas and practices, both at the cultural level and ideological level. And that it doesn't talk about, say, capitalism or the need to overthrow it, or the need for socialism, so that what these groups normally fight for is better resources for those groups in those groups. And then, so all you're fighting for is a bigger share of the cake, rather than to sort of make another cake or give it a different shape altogether. Also, it means that because class alliances haven't been built right across the board, then working class people in the majority mainstream society, so for example in Britain, white working class people, haven't been able to build those alliances with identity politics because they haven't been included, or those alliances haven't been built, and therefore those working class people in the majority groups find it easier to ally themselves with their oppressors. So white working class people are more likely to ally themselves with white bosses rather than black working class people or women working class groups, etc. So there's infights on those accounts. So the lack of class analysis, the criticism goes, is that the right, the political right, far right groups are now much more in evidence because of identity politics, partly because of identity politics, and left's failure, particularly the failure of Marxism, to incorporate and give voice to those struggles. I'll just stop it there.
1989, Surinder. Is there anything you'd like to add based upon the past 30 years since then? Or do you think the article still holds up? I mean, it's 30 years, it talks about Thatcherism.
Yeah, I think it still holds in the main. I think those criticisms are fair. But as I said before, when I started, is that, you know, we've been part of those movements. So it didn't feel like, it still doesn't feel like when we talk about women, for example, or black people, it doesn't feel as though we're not talking about economic struggles. But if you actually look at the politics in practice, then those criticisms do seem relevant.
I came in late, so I've missed most of the presentation. My thoughts on identity is that I think I said it the last time we met, that there are positive sides to it and there are negative sides to it. I think the positive side is that it helps to focus the particular oppression or the particular needs of specific identity. And that way you can, it helps to build a pressure group around that issue, those specific issues. But if we think that continuing with the identity politics is actually going to resolve the issues in the longer term. I think there's a lot, that is actually far-fetched in my view. And the other thing was, I think Surinder mentioned obviously that there always seems to be a lack of a class analysis in these groups. And the other thing I wanted to say was that it is not only the oppressed, identity groups that favor identity political approach. It is also the ruling identity people that favor that. We have the classic example of Hindutva in India. You know, they are vigorously pushing the Hindu identity, and in order to maintain its dominance, right? And they are obviously in cahoots with the corporations and the capitalist, oligarchy and all that kind of stuff. So identity politics is being played to their own advantage of maintaining the state oppression and maintaining the stronghold on the state. So that's what I wanted to interject with. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you're right. And in fact, if you could argue that identity politics didn't begin in the 1980s, but actually the colonial project with its sort of white supremacy is identity politics in a way. But also, more recently, given the rise of the far right and Hindutva, as you say, they do play that the identity game as well. So it has a backlash, I think.
I mean, I think, it's the way the thing is being put is that there's politics and then there's identity politics. I don't know what the other politics is, okay? But in fact, identification is a product of the struggle. So at one time we identify ourselves as Blacks because the struggle we were involved in was the anti-racist struggles as migrants who had come predominantly from Black and brown countries into this place. And we were fighting racism. That identified us because it was the struggle that identified us, and that was of significance at the time because it united us. What brought us together was the fact that we faced racism more or less in the same way as a group, and therefore we fought as that. And class itself is an identity because you come together as a class, you've got certain characteristics that define you as a class. It doesn't have to be the color of your skin or the faith or anything. It can be it is certain characteristics. So you are somebody who has got nothing to sell but his labor. That identifies you as working class. But in that also, you see, the identification could depend upon what is happening at a current point in history. So if the struggle is taking place in a third world country, where most of the working classes, because there isn't one working class, because the peasantry is also a class that works for its living, right? How it gets paid is maybe different, right? And they did identify with each other, with the working classes and with the proletariat in the third world countries. So I think identification is something that is specific to a particular point in history. It is specific to what is actually happening at that point in history. So, we can't just say that identity politics is bad, because all politics is identification, identifying yourself in a particular side of the struggle. So you identify with the oppressor, that makes you one identification. If you're those who are fighting that oppression identifies you in a different way. So all politics to me is identifying where you stand and then fighting on that basis. So it is all politics is identity politics. So why we are demonizing identity politics, and it's probably used by the right to subdue the struggle, to subdue the people who are actually resisting by demonizing them.
I don't know, because if for instance you've got black groups and women's groups who only fight for the progression of women or progression of black people, and then I mean, now we've got in Britain, we've got black MPs, we've got black councillors and people in authority of all sorts of things, and women even more so, and then the fight is still for women's progression without any sort of analysis of which women and what they do, then that there's a lack in that, isn't there?
I'm hoping that we're not all women don't think we are Priti Patels.
Well, no, but it gives those people who push for the likes of Priti Patel to argue that they're in the feminist movement. Yeah. Of course, the feminist movement is divided in all sorts of ways, but it allows some sections to argue just, well, that's enough then, women are doing well. And
I mean, just as well, I mean, I don't think I am, the previous chancellor, whatever his name was, Javed. Yeah. So, we don't identify with him because he doesn't identify with us as well. He identifies with Boris. So it's predominantly what has been, I think this whole thing about identity politics is a way of demonizing struggles.
I'm not.
Can I just go ahead? Yeah.
Colton, I think you have to raise your hand higher.
Oh, okay. It's high here. Yes, Surinder, thank you for circulating that article. I mean, I might have read it a long time ago. I don't remember, but I thought it was a good article because it's talked about my sort of involvement with politics in a way. It's at the time when I got involved, and so it was quite a good way of looking at it. And in some ways, although Thatcherism seems like, long time back in history, in a way, all the changes that occurred during the Thatcher period and neoliberalism and all that, and the globalization, we actually suffering through that now. So it has continued. And I thought that article gave really good analysis about information technology and things. So obviously in the earlier stages of that, I mean, we're 30 years on, so we're even further down the road, but it started discussing that. So that was quite a good way of putting it in the context of economics, if you like, and the modes of production and how that changed within Britain, at least anyway. Which is, from the industrial to the information technology. So I thought that was very good. I think, to me, this sort of making sort of dichotomy of it's either or, it has to be either identity politics or intersectionality, as if it's something completely different to looking at it from a left. It seems, because I sort of keep thinking, well, if I'm involved in some kind of struggle, I'm inevitably going to bring my analysis of the position that I'm in into that struggle. So my sort of position as a Black woman, but a professional sort of privilege at the same time, that sort of combination is going to contribute to a given struggle. It doesn't negate it, but should we be putting that as the main, if you like, I think in the article it talks about the main age or something, cutting age or something, that sort of a phrase it uses. And I think that's where the left or the Marxist analysis should come in, within a group. I think we should be talking about identity. I mean, the fact that organizing as separately as women, organizing separately as Black women, I think gives us strength. It's a positive way of providing struggle and contributing to struggle, but that shouldn't stop us contributing to and joining with. And in fact, we have done that. Struggles that will move the whole, joining with organizations or campaigns or whatever that will move the whole struggle forward in an effective way. So, I think this sort of thing that somebody's bringing in 4 or 5 different aspects, I think that happens anyways, doesn't it? So I was quite at loss to say why that has been put as if it's some sort of different and special analysis.
Indicated identity politics emerging in the 70s and 80s has a distinct meaning, and it's probably better called recognition politics. It's an attempt to compensate for the misrecognition of certain types of people. So, and the recognition movements, what we now call identity politics, arose because of failure of mainstream Marxist analysis, which was Eurocentric and white and male. And it is the deficits in that kind of thinking which led to the need for non-white, non-male oppressed peoples to develop their own analysis of their oppression. So that identity politics or recognition impulses, the move to seek recognition status, arose out of a certain context. It's very different to other identity politics which predate this movement. So, for example, the ultimate expression of another stream of identity politics is fascism. Fascism builds its own philosophy around an identity which is exclusive and othering. So that's a different sort of identity politics, not to be confused with what we're talking about here, which is recognition theory, about a recognition of women as women, Black people as Black people, disabled people as disabled people, within a context of oppression in general. It is not true to say either that this sort of recognition politics has no class analysis. The second, third, and fourth wave of feminism expressly address class issues. So it's a parody to suggest that identity politics of the sort I'm talking about has no class analysis. It does. But it seems to combine a subtle version of class analysis to show that within class itself, there are other oppressions in operation. And so the great contribution of identity politics about which we are talking is how it nuances oppressions so that you can establish oppressions within a class. There are oppressions within the working classes, there are oppressions within the middle classes. So it takes class as a real phenomena and seeks to understand it better. So in that sense, this kind of politics, and it's got nothing to do with the politics of a caste system in India or other types of identity politics. That's a different stream of thought. That fascist stream of thought has got nothing to do with women's liberation or gay liberation or liberation of disabled people. It's got nothing to do with fascism. And so we owe a great deal, as Marxists, we owe a great deal to the analyses and struggles undertaken by women and gay men and black people in the 60s and 70s to unravel what class oppression is all about. So I'm just trying to stress that's very important, that when we talk about identity, we're talking about a particular movement not identity in general. We're not talking about fascist identities, not talking about nativism, we're not talking about white supremacy. Of course, I refer to identity, but it's something different. This is about understanding within class oppression, there are other oppressions in operation. And it's unraveling those things, which is the great contribution in the pursuit of truth. Okay.
Abu wanted to say something.
Yeah, I mean, you know, when you talk about class, I mean, you identify with the working class. But in the last general election, the majority of the working class voted for the Tories, and the Red Wall fell. And also with the women's liberation struggle, you know,
True.
a lot of white women, you know, contributed to white supremacism. So how do you have class or gender solidarity when such large segments of that people you know, are reactionary? Anyone?
Understood what that article was saying was that is the perspective and the way of looking at it is only by incorporating the women's struggles, even some of the women who would be, if you like, you know, although we should be concentrating on the working class, but actually even other class of women who suffer oppression, only by incorporating that into socialist agenda and socialist program can actually, and similarly with the Black politics, because there's going to be, as we talked earlier, there's going to be different class of people, and there's enough Black people voting for Tories and Labour as it is. But incorporating the oppression of those, or the struggles of those groups into Marxist analysis, that's the only way of success. Without it, it won't succeed, basically. You know, having very purely, we're going to just have a narrow white working class struggle, or even just general working class struggle, without any actually incorporation of the women's struggles within that and Black struggle within that, it won't be successful. I think that's how I understood. Instead of personal being political, and he uses the phrase the other way around, political being personal. It's the way to look at it.
Can I just say that the women's movement had very clear unraveling of Marxism and class analysis and stuff. And I think Black struggles, the Black movement did to a certain extent as well. And the disability movement too. But I'm not sure whether the same is true of other than sort of identity groups that, so for example, sexual orientation, ageism and stuff. I mean, they do to a certain extent, but if you sort of look at the momentum of the groups, that doesn't come through in terms of what they're fighting for and things. So I think my feeling is if they're just stuck with being only identifying on a basis of a very narrow basis without a larger critique of social inequalities, then they'll have a very limited impact.
Of fighting racism, there were two things. There were, first of all, inbuilt self-interest, which broke the solidarity within the class itself, and also it was used by the oppressing class to maintain that oppression and divide. So divide and rule, for example, when we talk about that. to give people privileges, crumbs, and then bring them on their side. So I think, what brings us together is the common struggle we are fighting for. So I think in those days it was the black, and going forward after Margaret Thatcher, there was an attempt made to even divide that struggle against racism into compartments. So it becomes a struggle within that black identity itself, and neutralizes it. So I think that's there's the aspect of how the oppressor themselves try and create divisions, or try and exploit the divisions, and bring about different identities. And we start fighting for our individual identities. That's a different issue. Because identity as blacks, we identify as blacks, that's an identity as well. But now we identify ourselves as Kashmiris and as Pakistanis, Indians, and everything else, right? That may have certain, reasons for doing it. It could be legitimate in other places. It's not totally counterproductive.
Okay, this Brian, yeah.
Yeah, I agree with the point about obviously this recognition politics has potentially enriched Marxism, and I agree with Surinder that in the absence of linking up struggles, that any progress is only going to be very limited and for a few. But I think there is another wider economic background to all this, that the working class in a country like Britain has been bought off probably for centuries, and this has allowed politics to be dominated by parliamentary politics, which is very much a diversion from the class struggle. And it's not surprising in that vacuum that the identity politics has become so dominant, and when there isn't anything substantial in the way of the class struggle and leading it, then oppressed groups are going to just get on and make the best of things, or give up totally. And I think you can't separate this phenomenon and how pervasive it has become, sometimes with obvious merit for the oppressed groups, that the effect of imperialism on somewhere like Britain, which has also, up till relatively recently, allowed for the luxury of these things to prosper, and people from oppressed groups to actually move up within the system. So I think there's that wider context that's got to be looked at. Also back in the day, when I was involved in gay rights campaigning back in 71, around then, in Reading, we went out and did factory leafleting and what have you, and did some stuff to try and link gay rights with Marxism. I don't dare look back at it now, because I'm sure it was crap. But these things did exist, and now you see that with gay pride and what have you, it's all about getting on and what have you, and superficial. All the politics has disappeared because there was nobody or no movement to actually develop these things politically.
Mm.
Brian, if you were there in 71 in Reading, I must have met you there. I was there myself in 71 in Reading.
Oh, right.
In that same movement. I don't recall seeing you, but you probably changed quite a bit.
Yes.
Didn't have the big beard.
No.
Well, nor did I. Brian, we're both then young and naive.
Yes.
Can I make a point about picking up the thing about recognition, because it's very important to understand that its proper name is misrecognition politics. In other words, for fights by black people, by women, by gay people, by disabled people, is to challenge the identity given to them by the ruling class. It's an attempt to transform their self-image through struggle. So the women's movement began in the 60s and 70s in its modern form in an attempt to transform the image given of them by men. So these movements were attempts to overthrow misrecognition of themselves as people. And that was a struggle. That's in true Marxist tradition, is to overthrow and challenge how they were perceived by the ruling classes. So men perceive women certain ways, and women are expected to have certain roles given to them by men. So feminism began in an attempt to challenge those preconceptions and to change those roles by struggle and community action. So I do ask people to forget the term identity politics. It's so confusing because it gets mixed up with far-right identity politics. These movements were not far-right. They're part of the Marxist tradition of challenging the status quo, of challenging the hegemony, of challenging the ruling classes. And these movements are designed to capture and self-define themselves as real people, to transform misrecognition into an authentic self-identity. And that is within the Marxist tradition of challenging status quo. It's totally compatible. How it's worked out is another story. And I think the article suggests how it took a wrong turn into oneness, into one's own ego. But it doesn't have to be that way. If we want to understand what's wrong with the world, then we need to understand what's wrong with how women are treated, how gays are treated, how disabled people are treated. We need to understand and share and recognize their experiences and incorporate those experiences into our own experiences. Only in that way can we have a socialist movement which recognizes that your oppression is my oppression and vice versa. We have the groundwork for it. It can happen. We shouldn't take sides, being Marxists or being identity politicians. The two must come together.
Sense that it's not really what we're discussing, but I think another thing we need to look at is that how the various, how through struggle things change. So for example, if we look at two things that we've been looking at, is one is fighting racism. That has been turned on its head. All right, now it's the blacks who are being oppressed on the basis of being that they are racist. So, the people who are being punished most on this anti-Semitic thing are actually blacks or even Jewish in many cases, and quite often Muslims. So I think if you look at the MPs who've been accused of all sorts of things were Muslim MPs or Asian MPs. The people who've been actually expelled from the Labour Party, majority of them were blacks, or quite a few of them were Jewish as well. And then if we come to the gay pride thing, for example, it has actually been taken over by HSBC. And in fact, Israel is using that as a basis of, pinkwashing its own oppression and saying, we are on your side and we are fighting for you. And the reasons why we have to oppress the Palestinians is because they are anti-gay and anti. So, these things do turn on their head as well. So, Boris Johnson is now the prime fighter against racism, so whatever else is coming out of the Labour Party and everything else. And that's not just a coincidental thing for the short period of time. I think that is going to continue for a long period of time. In fact, what we are doing is we are supporting the worst form of racism there is in terms of an apartheid state and everything else. So, you know, things are never fixed. They keep moving with struggle. They keep developing, they keep changing.
It's called dialectics.
Yep.
Yeah.
Can I make a just very important point I forgot to mention? Right-wing identity politics is based upon exclusion. Right-wing identity politics excludes the other. It's exclusive. Left-wing identity politics is based upon inclusion. It seeks to include others who are not included. It's a very different sort of identity process, and we must keep the two quite distinct and separate. Identity politics based upon exclusion leads to fascism. Identity politics based upon inclusion leads to socialism. It's a big, big difference.
I don't think it always does though, Paul, because I think certain sections will. So for example, if you look at, say, the women's movement, you got the sort of radical feminists who, you know, saw men as the main enemy and weren't, you know, going to come anywhere near any sort of alliances with men. Similarly, you know, with black struggles and stuff, there will be people that won't come anywhere near white people for similar reasons, etc. So I think, you know, is it who wins out in any struggle, I suppose, I mean, even in class struggle, but I don't think you can take it as read that it's always inclusive. I agree with you in the main, theoretically, it's all inclusive, and there's a strong difference between that, the left and the right identity politics in that sense.
I'm speaking abstractly, so of course, individuals within the women's movement can be right-wing, can be fascist. I'm talking about the logic of one, the logic of the other. Right-wing identity politics logically leads to exclusion. Left-wing identity politics logically leads to inclusion. Doesn't mean say it's going to happen. I'm about its actual logic, where it should take us. Yeah.
It's not really doesn't fit in with anything that's said up to now, but it just strikes me that that although we talk about these different strands of identity politics altogether, I think there is a big distinction in practical terms, at any rate, between struggle against racism, which links with Black identity politics, and the other strands we're talking about of struggle of women, gay, disabled, etc., which is that that's in relation to the principal contradiction of class, because and Sivanandan hints at it in his article, doesn't go into any depth, that the major exploitation at the present time is of what he calls the third world. We can still use that term perhaps, but that the basis of exploitation has moved from the developed capitalist countries more and more to the exploitation, the imperialist exploitation of the third world, and the particular groups in this country, the Black minority groups, are directly linked to those classes and peoples, nationalities in the third world who are specifically oppressed by imperialism and are the core of the current contradiction in capitalism. Whereas the other groups, the other identity struggles, if you like, and they don't make that link, so that there is a clear link between class as part of the anti-imperialist struggle and the struggle against racism in the developed countries. Certainly that was definitely much more the case, I think, in back in the 70s and 80s, and it may well be that that is now changing. Well, I think to a great extent it is changing now as different generations come up, and the link between those people and the countries that they were originally linked to starts to attenuate. But I certainly think that distinction is quite important in terms of analysing how the importance of those struggles and how they can actually be used practically in terms of a struggle against the ruling class in this country. I'm not suggesting that the other struggles in any way are less or less important or anything like that, but I think there is a distinction to be made between them.
I think that distinction was made with the Black feminist movement, and also, you know, feminist movements in third world countries, certainly. So it's stronger for it. And also, I think in terms of even disability and things, that's been made to a certain extent as well. I'm not sure about, I don't know enough about sexual orientation and that, gay rights movements and stuff. But yeah, Brian.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't disagree with what Jim said, but I think a similar argument can actually be applied to the women question, in that sort of the amount of unpaid labour and unrecognised labour that actually keeps capitalism going both in the centre and the periphery, and also the fact that sort of with the migration of men in particular to sort of be factory fodder, quite often the peasant agricultural economies are increasingly being the labour for that is proportionally much greater in terms of women now, and that has a big add-on effect in terms to the global food production. So I think that, I mean, the two are not parallel, but I think the sort of to not sort of look at the women's question sort of in that wider context as well is it would be wrong.
Actually, similar to what the discussion we've just been having, because Sivanandan's big critique, one of his criticisms of the identity politics is that there's a whole third of the population which are at the bottom and left out of everything. And that's what Jim was referring to, the black people, migrant workers, all those sort of people. Therefore, that's why he's critical of the identity politics as they were presenting at that moment in time. So I was just really going along with that point.